The IV line had blown in Bay 4, and the woman they'd just escorted out of Millhaven General stood in the parking lot listening to the alarm, screaming through the glass doors. Not panicking, not crying, just standing there with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes already moving back toward the entrance like she'd never really left. Her name was Sera Wolfe, and inside that hospital someone was about to die because nobody had thought to check the secondary access port. She went back in anyway. The security guard, a young man named Doucette, who'd been the one to walk her out 20 minutes earlier, opened his mouth and closed it again when she pushed past him. Sera didn't explain herself. She never did. She moved through the ER the way she always moved. Efficient, quiet, like water finding the lowest point in a room. The crash cart was rolling toward Bay 4. 2 residents were shouting over each other. The charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Gruel who'd made her life miserable for the better part of 8 months, was pointing at the monitor and not at the patient. Sera looked at the patient. Female, mid-40s, unconscious, the kind of gray-blue color that meant she'd stopped being someone's theoretical problem and had started being someone's actual emergency. She stepped in. Gruel turned. His face went from red to something darker. "You don't work here anymore." "I know," Sera said, and adjusted the port. 30 seconds later, the monitor climbed. The patient's color shifted. One of the residents exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since Tuesday. Gruel grabbed her arm. She looked at his hand until he let go. "Security," he said. "Call whoever you want," Sera said. "She's stable now." She walked back out into the November cold of Hartwell, Ontario, where the sky was the color of old concrete and the parking lot smelled like diesel and the first snow that hadn't quite decided to fall yet. She had her jacket in one hand and a cardboard box with 8 months of her life in it tucked under her arm, a spare pair of shoes, a dog-eared copy of a Mavis Gallant collection she'd been reading on breaks. Not much to show for it. She'd known it was coming. Had known since the first incident report, probably. You didn't file 3 and 6 weeks at Millhaven General without someone eventually deciding you were more trouble than you were worth. The violations were real: medication storage temperatures that didn't meet protocol, staffing ratios that a first-year student could see were dangerous, a surgical instrument that showed up in a post-op x-ray nobody had bothered to flag. Sera had flagged it. Sera had flagged all of it, in writing, with dates and times, and the specific names of the specific people who'd been told and done nothing. Director Beauchamp had called it insubordination. Sera had called it her job. One of them had the authority to fire the other, and it wasn't her. She was halfway to her car, a 12-year-old Civic that needed new brake pads and made a sound like a dying accordion when the heat kicked on when she heard it. Not a sound from inside the hospital this time. A sound from the road, the low, unmistakable percussion of military vehicles moving fast. She turned. 3 black SUVs came around the corner in tight formation. Behind them, a transport vehicle with federal plates. Behind that, 2 more SUVs with amber running lights cutting through the gray afternoon, like something that didn't belong in a mid-sized Ontario city on a Wednesday in November. Sera's pulse did something it hadn't done in years. She'd heard convoys like that before. In places where they meant either a rescue operation or a catastrophe, and sometimes you didn't know which until it was over. The vehicles pulled up to the ER entrance in a choreographed rush. Doors flew open. Personnel in tactical gear poured out. Not police, not RCMP, something federal and something military, and something that moved with the specific economy of people who had trained for exactly this. They were carrying a stretcher from the transport vehicle. Sera was moving before she decided to. She had no badge anymore, no authority, no reason to walk toward that entrance except the one she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't spent 2 tours running a forward aid station in conditions these people had probably only read about in briefings. The ER doors burst open. She could hear Gruel's voice rising in confusion. One of the residents asking who authorized this, the specific chaos of a civilian medical team encountering something they didn't have a protocol for. A tall woman in a colonel's uniform stepped out of the lead SUV. Late 40s, gray threaded through dark hair she wore pulled back, 3 rows of service ribbons, a name tag that read Arsenal. She had the kind of face that had been calm for so long it had settled into calm permanently. She saw Sera and her eyes narrowed. "This area is restricted. What happened to him?" Sera said. Something moved behind Arsenault's expression. "That's not information I'm sharing with civilians." "How bad?" A pause. "Just long enough to mean something. Bad enough." From inside, someone called for O negative. A monitor alarm went sustained, not the intermittent, the kind that meant a number had stopped being a number and started being a deadline. Arsenault turned toward the sound, then back. "You work here?" Sera hesitated. "1 beat. Not anymore." "Then you need to go." But Sera was already looking through the glass. She could see the stretcher, could see the body on it, the blood, the tactical vest, the specific way the trauma team was moving around him. Too slow, too uncertain, like people who knew the theory of hemorrhagic shock but had never seen it in a vehicle that was still burning. And she could see his face. She hadn't seen that face in 6 years. It was older now, harder, half obscured by an oxygen mask. But she knew the shape of that jaw, knew the scar above his left eyebrow where a piece of metal had caught him before she'd gotten there, before she'd been able to stop the thing that came after. Captain Brennan Oakes. He'd been a lieutenant when she'd known him. 26 years old and trying not to let anyone see how scared he was, and she'd been the one who'd figured out that the best way to keep him conscious during a medevac was to argue with him about hockey. He had opinions about the Senators that were genuinely wrong, and she'd told him so, and he'd stayed awake until they reached the surgical unit. He'd survived because she hadn't let him not survive. Sera walked through the doors. Doucette said her name. She kept walking. Gru stepped in front of her. She stepped around him. Her hands were already moving, gloves from the dispenser on the wall, assessment posture, eyes on the patient and the monitors and the IV access, and the way the fluid wasn't running the way it should. "Get out," Gru said. "I'll have you arrested. His pressure's at 62. Sera's voice came out flat, clinical, the voice she'd used in places where there was no room for anything else. "He's bleeding internally, and you're running volume into an access point that isn't patent. Move! You don't have privileges. Move!" Something in the room shifted. One of the tactical personnel near the wall, a staff sergeant with a face like a cliff face, took a half step forward. Not threatening, just present. Arsenal appeared in the doorway. "Let her work," she said. Gruel turned. "Colonel, with respect, this woman was terminated this afternoon. She has no legal authority to. I didn't ask about her legal authority." Arsenault's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I asked you to let her work." The room rearranged itself around that sentence. Sera's hands were already moving. Nudax at correct site, fluid adjusted. She called out orders that the nurses followed on instinct. They'd been trained to respond to that voice, that register, that particular certainty, and nobody stopped to question why they were doing it. The monitor numbers moved. Slowly, then less slowly. The surgical team arrived 11 minutes later, assessed the situation in 30 seconds, and had Oakes on a gurney to the OR within 4 minutes of walking through the door. Sera stepped back. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them against her thighs so nobody would see. The trauma bay had gone quiet in that particular way that meant the immediate emergency had passed, and everyone was now dealing with the fact of what had just happened. Gru was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. The residents looked like first years again. The tactical personnel that probably only other military people would notice. Arsenault walked over. "Who are you?" "Who are you?" she asked. "Wolfe, Sera Wolfe." She paused. "Formerly Sergeant Wolfe, 8 years, 2 tours, MOS 68W. Something moved behind Arsenault's expression again. Calculation, maybe, or recognition of a specific type. "You served in theater, yes. You know Captain Oak Forward Aid Station, Kandahar, 2018. Sera's throat tightened. He had a femoral bleed and strong opinions about the Ottawa Senators. I kept him talking. Arsenault was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a tablet, tapped something, turned the screen toward Sera. Her own face looked back at her, in uniform. The caption read, "Sergeant Sera Wolfe, 68W, Combat Medic. Meritorious Service Medal." And below that, in smaller text, a list of mission deployments that she'd spent 6 years not thinking about. "You disappeared after discharge," Arsenault said, "changed cities, went back to school, became a civilian nurse in a mid-sized Ontario hospital." Sera said nothing. "I think," Arsenault continued, "you were trying to leave it behind. Thought if you kept your head down long enough, it would stop feeling like it was still happening." She tilted her head slightly. "How's that working out for you?" Director Beauchamp's voice came from the corridor before Sera could answer. Colonel Arsenault. He was a compact man in an expensive suit who moved like someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "I need to discuss what's happening in my hospital." "Your hospital," Arsenault said, turning to face him, "is currently operating under Federal Emergency Medical Authority. You'll receive documentation within the hour. You can't simply." "I already did." Arsenault looked back at Sera. "Captain Oakes is going to survive. Again. Because of the same person." She walked away, leaving Sera standing in the bloodstained trauma bay while Beauchamp sputtered about jurisdiction, and Gru stared at the floor and the whole careful, ordinary life she'd been trying to build in Hartwell. Ontario tilted on its axis and broke apart at the seams. The surgery took 4 hours. Sera spent them in the surgical waiting area, surrounded by tactical personnel who treated her like a colleague and hospital staff who didn't know what category to put her in. Arsenault stayed. Her command team spread across a cluster of chairs with tablets and phones, turning the corner of a waiting room into something that functioned like an operations center. When the surgeon emerged, everyone stood. "He's stable," he said. "Splenic laceration, significant blood loss, but he's going to be fine." Arsenault nodded once, the way people do when then holding a specific breath for a specific amount of time. "You saved his life," she said to Sera afterward. "I assessed his access site and adjusted his fluid management. Sera sat down. The surgical team saved his life. Don't minimize it. I'm not. I'm being accurate. Arsenault sat across from her. Outside the window, Hartwell had gone dark. The first snow had finally started to fall, thin and unconvinced, disappearing before it reached the pavement. We're going to have a conversation, Arsenault said, about why you've been hiding in this hospital for 8 months. I wasn't hiding. You were invisible. That's the same thing. Sera didn't have an answer for that. Beauchamp appeared at the end of the hallway. He had 2 men in suits with him. The suits had that specific posture that meant federal, not provincial. Colonel, he called, I've been in contact with legal counsel. Regarding Nurse Wolfe, Sergeant Wolfe, Arsenault said without turning. She entered a restricted medical area without privileges. She performed interventions without authorization. I'm pursuing charges, criminal trespass, practicing without a license. Go, Arsenault stood. While you're doing that, the investigators who've been going through Millhaven General's records for the past 3 weeks will continue going through them. Beauchamp's expression changed. We flagged this facility, Arsenault continued, after 2 Canadian Armed Forces veterans died here within a month of each other. Both deaths preventable. Both incidents documented by Nurse Wolfe and then buried by administration. She walked toward him. The incident reports she filed, federal investigators have them. Every single one. And right now they're trying to determine why those reports consistently disappeared from your internal database before any action was taken. One of the suited men stepped forward. Mr. Beauchamp, we'd like to speak with you. Beauchamp's face had gone the color of old chalk. This is, he started. You ran this hospital like a revenue exercise, Arsenault said quietly, and you tried to fire the one person who was documenting exactly how dangerous that had become. They led him down the corridor. He was still talking when he turned the corner. His voice echoed and then didn't. Sera sat alone in the waiting room for a moment. Then Arsenault came back. There's something you should know, she said. We didn't find this hospital by accident. We found it because of a name. She held out a folder. Sera opened it. Private First Class Mathieu Gervais, 23 years old, died at Millhaven General 7 weeks ago of sepsis following a routine post-surgical complication. The kind of complication that shouldn't have been fatal with proper monitoring. The kind that wouldn't have been fatal if anyone had acted on the lab values that had been in the system for 14 hours before someone noticed them. Gervais had served 1 tour. He'd been home for 6 months. Sera remembered him. Not from the hospital. From a forward operating base in the Panjwai district, where she'd treated him for a shrapnel wound to his left arm, and he'd asked her, very seriously, whether she thought the Habs had a shot at the cup that year. She'd told him honestly, not this season. He'd laughed and said at least she didn't lie to him. She hadn't known he was in Hartwell. Hadn't known until right now that the name on the incident report she'd filed about the missed lab values, which Beauchamp's office had told her was under internal review and she should not discuss further, had been Mathieu Gervais. He died, she said. Not a question. Yes, because they didn't act on the flag, because the lab monitoring protocol had been cut 18 months ago as a cost reduction measure and nobody on the floor had been informed. And when you filed the incident report, someone in Beauchamp's office deleted it from the database within 48 hours. Arsenault sat beside her. Your copy is what gave investigators the timeline they needed. Sera set the folder down. Her hands were very still. You want to tell me I was being used, she said. I want to tell you that you did exactly what you would have done regardless. We just happened to be watching. For how long? Since your 4th incident report. About 5 months. Sera looked at her. You let him fire me. We needed him to fire you. Terminating a whistleblower is a separate charge. Arsenault held her gaze. I know that's not comfortable to hear. It wasn't. Sera sat with it for a while. Real snow now, the kind that would stick. Captain Oakes is awake, Arsenault said. He's asking for you. The ICU was quieter than the rest of the hospital in the way that all ICUs were quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but suspended, like time moved differently here. Oakes was propped slightly upright, oxygen monitor on his finger, IV running, the specific pallor of someone who'd lost a lot of blood and been put mostly back together. When Sera walked in, something in his face changed. Wolfe, he said. His voice came out rough but present. Knew it was you. Something about the way you moved. You've got to walk like you're still pissed off about that first deployment. I was always pissed off. You just noticed it. He almost smiled. You saved my life. I adjusted your fluid access. You always did that, minimized everything. You held a tourniquet on Corporal Lasalle's leg for 40 minutes, and when I asked how you were holding up, you said, it's a tourniquet, sir, not a dissertation. Sera sat in the chair beside his bed. The memory of Lasalle arrived the way it always did. Not a flashback, just a wait. Lasalle had lived. Most of them had lived. Not all. There's something I need to ask you, she said. Ask Private Gervais, did you know he was at this hospital? Oakes's expression shifted, became careful. Not until 6 weeks ago. We'd been tracking the veteran deaths, that's what brought us here. When his name came up, I requested that my unit be routed through Hartwell for an extraction operation we had running in the region. He paused. I wanted someone on the inside, someone who would actually look. You knew I was here. I knew you'd left the forces and gone into nursing. I knew you'd ended up in Hartwell. I didn't arrange for you to be here, Wolfe. But I won't pretend I wasn't relieved when you were. She sat with that. He asked me if the Habs were going to win the cup. What did you tell him? That they weren't. Oakes looked at her for a moment. He would have laughed at that. He did. The ICU was quiet. Someone's monitor beeped 3 times and settled. Through the window, Hartwell's skyline was disappearing under snow. There's a position, Oakes said. Arsenal mentioned it. Clinical Director of Emergency Services. They're restructuring the department. I know. Are you going to take it? Sera didn't answer right away. She thought about the 8 months of night shifts. The incident reports that went nowhere. Gruel's voice cutting across the floor whenever she got too close to something true. The specific exhaustion of doing the right thing inside a system that had decided the right thing was too expensive. She thought about Mathieu Gervais asking about hockey in a foreign country while she held his arm together and dying 7 weeks ago in a hospital in his own city because someone cut a line item from a monitoring protocol. I'll think about it, she said. Oakes closed his eyes. No, you won't, he said, and his voice was already getting heavier. You'll take it. You always take the hard thing. It's your most annoying quality. She sat with him until he was asleep. In the corridor outside, Arsenal was waiting. Beauchamp's in federal custody, she said. His deputy director is cooperating. We've identified 3 other facilities in the network. Same ownership group, same pattern of veteran patient admissions with inflated billing and degraded care protocols. Sera processed that. How much? Preliminary estimate. $4 million over 3 years. Veterans Affairs billing, primarily. They knew the paperwork was complicated and the patients were unlikely to advocate for themselves. Something cold settled in Sera's chest and stayed there. Mathieu Gervais died for $4 million. He died because someone decided his life was less important than a balance sheet. Arsenal met her eyes. Which is why we need people like you running departments instead of being run out of them. Sera picked up the offer letter. Read it, set it down, read it again. Director of Emergency Services, Millhaven General, salary, authority, responsibility for every decision, every patient, every outcome. She thought, I'm not qualified. She thought, you ran a field hospital in a province you couldn't name in public with equipment held together by will and improvisation and the specific stubbornness that comes from deciding you're not going to lose today. She thought about Gervais. I have conditions, she said. Arsenault almost smiled. Name them, full hiring authority, no administrative interference in clinical decisions. Direct oversight line to federal investigators during transition. And she paused. Gruel gets a review, not a dismissal. He spent 20 years as a nurse before he became whatever he became here. People don't turn into that from nothing. I want to know what they turned him into before I decide what to do about it. Arsenault looked at her for a moment. Done. Except the Gruel part is yours to determine. Sera took the pen. She signed. The weeks that followed were the hardest she'd worked since discharge, and that was saying something. The department was worse than she'd thought. Equipment outdated, supplies disorganized, staffing ratios that would have been indefensible under any provincial standard she could cite. She made lists. She made calls. She held meetings that nobody enjoyed and issued directives that some people followed immediately and some people tested, and one person, a senior resident named Fournier, openly challenged in front of the nursing staff on her 3rd day. She waited until he was done. Then she said, "You're right that I don't have the surgical experience you do. You're wrong that it matters for this conversation, which is about monitoring protocols, not procedures. Do you want to keep being right about the wrong thing, or do you want to help me fix this department?" Fournier had stared at her. Then he'd said, "What do you need from me?" She told him. By the end of the month, Fournier was running the intern orientation program and had stopped challenging her in public, though he occasionally challenged her in her office, which she found she didn't mind at all. Gruel was harder. She called him into her office on day 5. He sat across the desk from her with the posture of someone expecting execution. "Tell me what happened," she said. He looked at the floor. Beauchamp, a start from the beginning. It took 40 minutes. Beauchamp had been systematically removing senior nursing staff who filed complaints or pushed back on protocol cuts. Gruel had watched 3 people lose their jobs in 6 months and decided the easiest way to survive was to become the person Beauchamp needed him to be. He'd buried reports, he'd looked the other way. He'd made Sera's life difficult because Beauchamp had made it clear that Sera was a problem that needed discouraging. "Did you know about Gervais?" Sera asked. Gruel's hands tightened on his knees. "Not until after. When I found out," he stopped. Started again. When I found out I couldn't sleep for a week, that's not absolution. I know, but it's information. Sera looked at him. You can resign, I'll make sure it's quiet, or you can stay under my supervision, every decision documented, and you help me rebuild what you helped break. One mistake and you're done. No second chance after that. Gruel was quiet for a long time. Why would you offer that? Because Mathieu Gervais is dead and firing you doesn't change that. Rebuilding this department might prevent the next one. Sera stood. You've got until end of shift. He stayed. The federal case moved quickly once Beauchamp started talking. The ownership group behind Millhaven General had 4 other facilities under the same administrative model. Veterans Affairs investigators identified systematic overbilling across all 5 sites, inflated procedure codes, unbundled services, billing for monitoring that had been quietly discontinued. The total, when investigators finished, was closer to 6 million than 4. Beauchamp got 7 years. His deputy director cooperated and received a reduced sentence. The ownership group's principals were charged federally. Sera gave a deposition that lasted 3.5 hours. She brought documentation for all of it, every incident report, every date, every name. The federal prosecutor called her the most organized witness he'd ever deposed. She said, I was a medic. We document everything. You never know when it's going to matter. On the day Beauchamp was sentenced, she was in Trauma Bay 2 running a code. She didn't find out until after, when Oakes texted her a single line from his rehabilitation facility in Ottawa. Justice, finally. How's the department? She texted back, better than yesterday. How's the shoulder? He replied, better than Kandahar. She put her phone away and went back to work. 6 months after she'd been escorted out of Millhaven General with a cardboard box and a dying accordion car, she stood in front of the full nursing staff for their monthly meeting and looked at the faces of people who'd spent 6 months figuring out whether to trust her. We had the best sepsis response time in the province last quarter, she said. Our veteran patient outcomes are up 40%. We still have problems. The equipment budget is an ongoing fight, and I know the scheduling is not where any of us want it, and the overnight coffee situation is a genuine crisis. A few people smiled, but we are not the hospital that let Mathieu Gervais die from a missed flag on a lab report. We are not that hospital anymore, and we're not going back. The applause wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of applause that meant something rather than sounding like it meant something, and Sera found she preferred that. Afterwards, Gruel found her in the corridor. I put in a transfer request, he said. Veteran Care Unit at the Civic in Ottawa. They have an opening. Sera looked at him. When? 3 weeks. I thought. He paused. I thought I'd rather spend the rest of my career trying to get it right than spending it trying to live down having gotten it wrong. That's a good thought, she said. It's because of what I watched you do. He held out his hand. Thank you for not firing me when you should have. She shook it. Don't make me regret it. He left. She watched him go. Then she went back to her office, sat at her desk, and looked out the window at Hartwell in winter. The streetlights coming on, the hospital parking lot full, the snow that had been thin and unconvinced in November now solid and certain on every surface. Her phone rang. Arsenault. Thought you'd want to know, she said. The Morrison Foundation equivalent. There's a group starting here, Canadian equivalent, supporting medics transitioning to civilian healthcare. They want someone on the board. Someone who's done it. I know a few people who've done it. They specifically asked for you, Wolfe. Sera looked out to the window. Thought about the Civic with the dying accordion heater, which she'd finally got fixed in January. Thought about Mathieu Gervais and the Habs and the particular quality of light on a forward operating base at 3 a.m. when you were the only person standing between someone and whatever came next. Send me the information, she said. She hung up, pulled out the small thing she kept in her jacket pocket, a metal disc worn smooth, the kind of identifier that didn't belong to her and that she carried anyway. Gervais had left it in the system with her name listed as his medical contact. Some administrative quirk, probably, but it had ended up in her hands after the federal investigation concluded, and she'd kept it because she'd decided that was what you did with the people you carried. You carried them somewhere useful. You let them mean something going forward. She set it on the desk, opened her laptop, started drafting the new after-hours monitoring protocol that she'd been working on for a week. The one that would make sure that no lab flag sat unread for 14 hours ever again in this building. Outside, Hartwell was doing what it always did, moving, continuing, not noticing that something had shifted inside one mid-sized hospital on the edge of town, that the building had become something slightly different than it had been, that the people inside it were trying, imperfectly and sometimes reluctantly, to be better than they had been. Sera had spent 8 years in uniform learning that you couldn't save everyone. Had spent 6 years after that trying to forget what it felt like to learn it. Had spent 8 months in this hospital learning it again, the civilian version which hurt differently but hurt. And she had learned, finally, not from any single moment but from the accumulation of all of them, that the forgetting never worked, that you carried who you carried, that the weight of it didn't go away but it could go somewhere, could be shaped into something that moved forward instead of something that held you in place. She had been invisible for a long time because she'd decided it was safer. It wasn't safer, it was just lonelier. She worked until midnight, drove home through streets that had become familiar without her quite noticing when that happened. Unlocked the door to the apartment she'd slowly, over 8 months, started to make into something that looked like she intended to stay. She intended to stay. In the morning she would go back. She would run the department. She would fight the equipment budget and fix the overnight coffee and sit across the desk from people who were tired and scared and trying. And she would tell them the same thing she'd finally had to tell herself: you don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to keep showing up. She'd been the person nobody looked at twice. It turned out that was fine. She'd been looking all along.